Please be seated. Look at the trees, Jesus says. His friends, his followers, ask him about the end of the world. And he says, look at the trees. They want to know what signs they should look for about all the changes that are going to take place. And he says, look at the trees. How are we supposed to live in these times, they ask. Look at the trees, he says. This passage from Luke's Gospel is what we call apocalyptic literature. It also appears in Mark. Peyton preached on a very similar text a couple of weeks ago. That word apocalypsis means to reveal. It means to disclose. It doesn't mean to predict like we commonly think it does, but it's to reveal. And so what Jesus reveals in this passage, he's looking into a deeper reality, and what he says is that your spiritual lives and the health and well-being of the earth are one and the same thing. If you want to know how you are doing spiritually, as an individual and as a culture, as a society, take a good, hard look at the natural world. Look at the trees. So let's look at the trees. If you are able to walk through woods in this part of Virginia in the past 2 to 5 years, you will have noticed something curious. I've noticed it. My fellow woods walkers have noticed it. Foresters have noticed it. The red oaks are falling down faster than all the other trees. In strong windstorms in my neighborhood woods, afterwards, it's the red oaks that are down far more than the white oaks or the poplars or any other trees. Something's happening. We're not exactly sure what, but the trees are telling us something. If you walk down those steps right out there and turn left to that sidewalk right over there that goes to Chancellor Street, those steps, there's this large white ash tree. It's that tree right there. Looks in on us, kind of like an angel peering in on our worship. If you look at that, the bark on that tree, it looks like somebody's kind of shaved off some of the surface of the bark with kind of a draw knife. It's kind of blonde, telltale sign of emerald ash borer. It is an invasive insect that tree has no natural defense against. There are no predators in the ecosystem against that insect. The tree's been treated a couple times, but its fate is uncertain. That tree is speaking to us. It's telling us something about ourselves. It's telling us something about the world we've created. Jesus saw something. He saw something and he named it. It's something that we are daily insulated from. Many, if not most of us, are insulated from the natural world. And Jesus saw that the way in which we live, the way in which we organize our human society from the bottom to the top, impacts the natural world, for good or for ill, and mostly ill, as he points out. The providers of our material abundance don't want us to see that. They hide the impact of our abundance from us. They want us to consume without consequences, and it's a lie we have all bought into. If Jesus is right, and I think he's dead right, that the natural world and human culture are entwined, and that what we do as humans injures the natural world, then we need an entire reworking of human society. And that's exactly what Jesus says throughout the Gospels, especially in Luke's Gospel. He says, the kingdom of God is near. over and over again, he is calling forth the kingdom of God because he's looking at human society and say, you guys are really messing up. And you have got to change this thing from the bottom up. You have got to try a spiritual way. You cannot heal the natural world with the same tools of liberal capitalism that have inflicted the injury. The market ain't going to get you out of this one. That is what has created the problem. It's not the solution. One of the most spiritual books that I've read recently is Suzanne Simard's latest book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. It's a New York Times bestseller, if that tells you anything. It was also got mentioned by Coach on the next to last episode of Ted Lasso. That's a pretty good review right there. But in that book, Simard does exactly what Jesus says. She looks at the trees. Simard is one of a growing number of scientists who've discovered that the forest is alive and are actually tracing what only the most spiritually attuned human beings were able to sense in years past. They're able now to trace how alive the forest is and the way it is connected. Science is showing us that the earth is alive in ways that we have been blind to or been blinded to. And Jesus reveals in this passage how our patriarchal imperial culture is killing the earth. Liberal Protestant Christians and right-wing evangelical fundamentalist types are both children of the Enlightenment. They both approach prophecy and apocalyptic literature in the same way. They see metaphor everywhere. They spiritualize the hell out of it, and they tie metaphors to their pet political agendas. Maybe I'm doing the same thing. I'm open to that criticism. But I'm trying to take the risk of taking Jesus at his word. Look at the trees. Not only does he say, look at the trees, in verse 25, there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on earth, distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the seas and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Remember his cosmology. He didn't have some kind of concept of the space-time continuum in outer space like we do. Stars and the sun were much closer in his imagination. They were part of the earthly experience. And what he's saying is, look at the atmosphere. Look at the climate around you. Look at the roaring of the oceans and the waves. They are telling you that something is desperately wrong with your society. You have gone astray, and the ocean is telling you that. He says that the nations will be distressed, but they will not agree on what they should do. Glasgow, 2021. Paris, 2015. Kyoto, 1997. The nations are not willing to address the underlying causes, so they argue about the symptoms. So many people misunderstand this prophecy. They say, oh, that's what God's going to do to us. God's going to bring those things on the earth to punish us. Jesus doesn't see it that way at all. That is a total misreading of what's going on here. Jesus says that the signs in nature don't come from the hand of God. They are the logical conclusion of your ways. This is patriarchy and all of the oppression that flows from that just playing itself out over the long term. All of your problems as human culture and society, all of your exploitation of nature is rooted in men seeking power and then projecting images of themselves onto the divine. And then Jesus says this curious thing. He says that in the midst of the cataclysm the Son of Man will appear. That's theology speak. That's theology speak to say that we will recognize the presence of the Christ, the divine life that flows through the earth. We will recognize the presence of this divine life in a new way. At this pivot point in human history, at this pivot point in the history of the earth, is an opportunity for a spiritual revolution, he says. It is entirely possible that the apocalypse becomes the moment in which a new culture, a new human society forges a new heaven and new earth. How do we do that, we might ask? How do we go about doing that, we might ask Jesus? Look at the trees. Incidentally, the old Anglo-Saxon word for tree is the same word for truth. Look at the trees, he says. We're just now learning how the forest is a biotic community rooted in cooperation, not competition, like we have thought and taught for centuries. And women are at the leading edge of this science. No surprise. The forest works together for the health and well-being of all of its members. The trees are showing us about the ways of God. They are teaching us more about God than the kings and the emperors and the men with power. Look at the trees, he says. They're not just signs. They're our spiritual guides.